Every little girl imagines the moment her father gives her away. I imagined mine would hug me, maybe embarrass me with a corny joke, and tell my husband to take good care of me. Instead, my father stood in the middle of our wedding reception, holding a sealed envelope, like it contained legal documents. Because it did. The DJ had just invited everyone back from the buffet when Dad tapped his fork against a champagne glass. "Can I borrow everyone's attention for just a minute?" The room went quiet. About 130 guests turned toward him. He smiled. Not the warm smile a proud father gives. It was the same smile he wore whenever he closed a big sale at the family lumberyard. Business. That's what this was to him. Business. He walked across the dance floor, stopped beside Ethan and me, and placed the envelope next to my dinner plate. "There you go, kiddo," he said. "Figured today was the right time." I looked at the front. My name. Typed. Not handwritten. Inside wasn't a wedding card. It wasn't a family letter. It wasn't even a congratulations. It was an invoice. Every page had our family's company logo in the corner. At the very bottom, total amount due, $251,480. I honestly thought someone had switched envelopes as a prank. Then I looked up. Dad wasn't laughing. Neither was Mom. Across the room, my younger sister Lily folded her arms with a tiny smirk, almost like she'd been waiting months to watch this moment play out. Ethan leaned toward me. "Babe?" His voice barely came out above a whisper. "You okay?" I looked at him, smiled, and nodded. I will be. Because there was something nobody in that room knew. While my father believed he'd just put me on the spot, I'd walked into that reception carrying my own envelope. He simply had no idea I'd brought receipts. Real ones. But before I tell you how our wedding turned into the most uncomfortable family reunion in county history, you need to understand something. My father didn't wake up one morning and decide to send his daughter a bill. He'd been preparing that invoice for almost my entire life. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. I just didn't know they were warnings. I thought they were normal. I grew up in a small Indiana town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Dad, Richard Carter, owned Carter Lumber Supply, a place that smelled like fresh-cut pine, motor oil, and sawdust. He loved numbers, loved profit margins, loved talking about expenses. Unfortunately, he talked about his family the exact same way. The first time I realized something was different, I was 8 years old. Christmas morning. The living room looked magical. Lights twinkled, wrapping paper covered the carpet. Lily was laughing so hard she couldn't even open her presents straight. Mom handed us hot chocolate while Christmas music played softly in the background. For a few minutes, it felt like every other family's Christmas. Then Dad grabbed his calculator. He sat down in his recliner, cleared his throat, and started reading prices out loud. Dollhouse, $69. Bike, $130. Winter coat, $94. Every gift, every receipt, every penny. When we finished opening presents, he added everything together and looked straight at us. "That's $612, he said. "You girls better remember that Santa doesn't work for free." Everyone chuckled. Even Mom. I forced myself to smile. But something inside me quietly changed that morning. Without realizing it, I stopped seeing presents as gifts. I started seeing them as debts waiting to be collected. And years later, while looking for nothing more than a blue ink pen, I opened a kitchen drawer and found something that proved Christmas hadn't been the beginning. It had only been the first entry. At least, that's what I realized the afternoon I found the notebook. I wasn't snooping. Honestly, I was just looking for a blue ink pen so I could finish my history homework. Mom always kept spare pens in the kitchen junk drawer, right next to the takeout menus, old batteries, rubber bands, and coupons nobody ever used. I pulled the drawer open. No pen. Instead, a worn blue spiral notebook caught my eye. It looked ordinary. The cover was bent, a coffee stain covered one corner. If I hadn't reached a little farther back, I probably never would have noticed it. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open. The very first page had one word written neatly across the top. Emma. Underneath it, rows of dates, dollar amounts, short descriptions. Diapers, $28.40. Doctor visit, $95. School shoes, $47.99. Birthday party, $63.15. At first, I thought Mom was keeping old family budgets. Then I turned another page. The entries continued. Every birthday, every dentist appointment, every school field trip, every winter coat, even the $5 she'd handed me for a science fair poster board had been written down. Page after page, year after year, like someone had been quietly tracking the cost of my existence. I felt my stomach tighten. Then I noticed another notebook underneath it. The same blue cover, only this one had a different name. Lily. She had one too. Every penny spent on both of us had been carefully recorded for years. I stared at the pages, trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe Mom just liked budgeting. Maybe this was harmless. Maybe... You looking for something? Mom's voice nearly made me jump out of my skin. I slammed the notebook shut. She was standing in the doorway, holding a basket of laundry. For just a second, our eyes met. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She just looked disappointed that I'd seen it. I was looking for a pen, I said. She nodded once. They're in the other drawer. No explanation. No apology. She simply picked up both notebooks, tucked them under her arm, and walked away like she'd just collected the mail. That night at dinner, nobody mentioned it. Dad talked about lumber prices. Lily complained about algebra. Mom passed the mashed potatoes. I kept staring at the notebook sitting in the back of my mind. For the first time in my life, I wondered if every family secretly kept score, or if mine was just different. Over the next few months, little things started making sense. Whenever I asked to join a school activity, Dad would sigh before saying yes. Not because of the time, because of the cost. Whenever Mom bought new sneakers, she'd quietly mention how we'd have to make up for it. If we ordered pizza on Friday night, Dad joked that we'd all be eating peanut butter sandwiches the following week. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But after finding that notebook, none of it sounded like jokes anymore. It sounded like accounting. By the time I turned 16, I'd stopped asking for almost everything. Need a new backpack? Mine could last another year. Class trip? I'd just stay home. Prom dress? I'd get one from the thrift store. It felt easier than hearing another conversation about money. Then, during the summer before my senior year of high school, Dad called what he referred to as a family meeting. That phrase alone made my stomach drop. Family meetings in our house never ended with good news. When I walked into the dining room, Dad was already sitting at the table. In front of him rested a manila folder. Mom stood quietly by the kitchen counter, drying the same coffee mug she'd already dried twice. Lily lingered in the hallway, pretending she wasn't listening. Dad slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. "I need your signature," he said. I looked down. Across the top, in bold letters, were 3 words that instantly made my pulse race. Family investment agreement. And somehow, I already knew signing that paper would cost me far more than money. I didn't touch it right away. The title alone made my chest feel tight. Family investment agreement. Who even calls something that? Dad folded his hands on the table, like he was waiting for a client to approve a loan. "Go ahead," he said. "Read it." So I did. The document claimed that my parents had made a significant financial investment in raising me, and that once I became financially successful, I would make every reasonable effort to repay that investment. It sounded official, almost legal, but something about it felt wrong. There wasn't a repayment schedule. There wasn't a specific amount, just vague promises wrapped in business language. "I don't understand," I said quietly. Dad leaned back in his chair. "It's simple. Your mom and I have sacrificed a lot to give you opportunities. One day, when you're doing well, you'll help take care of the family. That's how responsible people operate." I looked toward Mom. She avoided my eyes, pretending to rearrange the salt and pepper shakers. "Dad?" I hesitated. "Isn't that just what families do anyway?" A small smile crossed his face. "Exactly." "Then why does it need a contract?" The room went silent. For a moment, I thought he might actually answer. Instead, he tapped the paper with one finger. "Because handshakes are forgotten." I looked down again. College acceptance letters had already started arriving. I'd earned good grades, worked weekends at a local diner, and spent every spare hour chasing scholarships. Still, there was a gap. Books, housing, meal plans, money I couldn't cover alone. Dad knew that. He also knew I knew it. "If I don't sign?" His answer came without hesitation. "Then you'll figure college out yourself. No anger, no yelling, just facts. Or at least his version of them." The silence stretched across the room until it became unbearable. Finally, I picked up the pen. My hand shook as I signed my name. Emma Carter. The ink barely dried before Dad smiled. "There." He slipped the paper back into the folder. "Now we're on the same page." For some reason, those words hurt more than the document itself. As I stood to leave, I noticed Lily standing in the hallway. She'd heard everything. She looked at me for a long second before
"Are they going to
quietly
make me sign one too?" Nobody answered her. That question hung in the air long after dinner ended. A year later, I packed everything I owned into the back of my old Honda Civic and drove 3 hours north to start college. I thought leaving home would finally mean freedom. In many ways, it did. I worked before sunrise at a coffee shop just off campus. By afternoon, I was buried in accounting classes. On weekends, I tutored freshmen and picked up extra shifts whenever someone called out sick. Sleep became optional. Coffee became survival. Some nights I'd fall asleep with a calculator still sitting on my chest. It wasn't glamorous,
But every paycheck meant one less reason to ask my parents for help. 4 years later, I graduated near the top of my class. When they called my name across the stage, my friends cheered so loudly I could barely hear it. Dad clapped politely. Mom smiled for pictures. On the drive home, I waited. Maybe he'd finally say he was proud of me. Maybe today would be different. Instead, he glanced over from the driver's seat and said, "Looks like that investment is finally about to pay off." I turned toward the window before he could see the tears in my eyes. Because in that moment, I realized something heartbreaking. He hadn't watched his daughter earn a degree. He'd watched his stock go up in value. And just a few months later, the first phone call asking for money arrived. I answered without knowing it would become the beginning of an 8-year habit, one that would eventually lead back to the envelope sitting on my wedding table. The call came on a rainy Tuesday. I'd only been at my first accounting job for about 3 months. My office overlooked downtown Indianapolis, and I still felt like the new kid every time I walked through those glass doors. My first real paycheck had barely hit my account. I was finally starting to breathe. Then my phone lit up. Dad. I smiled before answering. "Hey, Dad." He skipped the small talk. "My truck's transmission blew." "Oh." "The repair shop says it's going to cost around $1,800. I waited. "So, I figured maybe you could help." Not would you, not if you can, just I figured. I looked at the tiny sticky note taped to my monitor. It listed my own bills: rent, student loans, car insurance, electric, groceries. For the first time in my life, I had responsibilities that belonged only to me. Still, he was my dad. "I can send $500 today," I said. There was a short pause. "That'll do." "No, thank you. No, I appreciate it." The call ended less than 2 minutes later. That afternoon, I transferred the money. I even texted him the confirmation. He replied with one word: received. That was it. Not long after, life settled into a routine. I worked hard, stayed late, earned the respect of my team. Little by little, my confidence grew. 6 months later, I received my first raise. I was excited. I called my parents to share the news. Mom sounded happy. Dad did some quick math. "So you'll be making almost $800 more a month now?" "I guess, after taxes." "Good." "Good?" That was his entire reaction. 3 days later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Mom. The furnace at the house finally gave out. I closed my eyes. "How much?" "The repair estimate is $3,100. I didn't even ask for paperwork. I wired the money that evening. A week later, Lily called. She sounded embarrassed. "My car died on the interstate. Are you okay?" "I'm fine." Relief washed over me. Then she added quietly, "Dad said maybe you could help me get another one." By the end of that week, another $4,000 had left my savings. Months turned into years. The requests never stopped. Sometimes it was property taxes. Sometimes it was medical bills. Sometimes it was just until next month. Next month never came. Every transfer felt temporary. Every promise sounded believable. And every single time, I convinced myself this would probably be the last one. After all, that's what family does, right? One Friday evening, after sending another payment for repairs at Dad's lumberyard, I opened my banking app and stared at my transaction history. There were so many transfers that scrolling through them took longer than I expected. The accountant in me couldn't ignore it anymore, so I opened Excel. Nothing fancy, just 5 simple columns: date, amount, reason, payment method, notes. The very first row read, Dad's truck, $500. I saved the file as family support. At the time, it wasn't evidence. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't preparation for some dramatic confrontation. It was simply a habit. Accountants organize things. That's what we do. But as the months rolled on, the spreadsheet kept growing. Transfer after transfer. Request after request. And one evening, while updating another payment, I noticed something I hadn't planned on tracking. Not once, not a single time, had anyone in my family ever said 2 simple words. Thank you. I stared at the screen for several minutes. Then I quietly added one more column. Acknowledged? The first row said no. The second row? No. Third? No. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, every single payment had the exact same answer. No. I leaned back in my chair and whispered to myself, "That's weird." At the time, I thought I was just documenting finances. I had no idea. I was documenting a pattern. And that pattern would become impossible to ignore the Thanksgiving when I accidentally overheard a conversation that changed everything I believed about why my family kept asking for money. Thanksgiving had always been complicated. From the outside, it looked picture perfect. Turkey in the oven, football playing in the living room, pumpkin pie cooling on the kitchen counter, neighbors dropping by to say hello. It looked like one of those holiday commercials, where everyone smiled a little too much. But behind closed doors, our family had always kept score. I drove back to my hometown early that Thursday morning. 3 hours on the interstate with a homemade pecan pie riding shotgun and an audiobook I barely listened to. Part of me was actually excited. Maybe this year would feel different. Maybe we'd just be a family. The second I walked through the front door, Mom hugged me. "I'm so glad you're here." Dad looked up from the football game. "Traffic bad?" "Not too bad." He nodded once before turning back to the television. That was our reunion. Later that afternoon, while Mom finished cooking, I offered to grab extra napkins from the hallway closet. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard voices coming from the pantry. Dad and Lily. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Honestly, I would have announced myself if I'd known they were there. But then I heard my name. "Emma's doing really well now," Lily said. Dad laughed quietly. "She should be." There was a short pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "After everything we've spent on her, she finally became profitable." Profitable. Not successful. Not independent. Profitable. I froze. My hand tightened around the doorknob. Lily didn't disagree. She actually chuckled. "Think she'll keep sending money?" Dad answered without missing a beat. "Why wouldn't she?" Another pause. "As long as she believes she's helping, she'll never stop." My stomach dropped. Helping? Was that all this had become? A strategy? I stood there for another few seconds, hoping someone would say it was a joke. Nobody did. Instead, Dad added something even worse. "She's the responsible one." Lily sighed. "Yeah, she's always been the easy one." Easy.
That word hit harder than I expected. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I'd spent years saying yes. Years convincing myself that love meant sacrifice.
Years believing if I just helped one more time, things would eventually feel normal. I quietly stepped away before they noticed me. When I returned to the dining room carrying the napkins, nobody acted differently. Dad carved the turkey, Mom asked everyone what they wanted to drink, Lily scrolled through her phone. I sat down across from them, smiling just enough to avoid questions. Dinner felt strangely unreal. Every compliment sounded rehearsed. Every laugh felt forced. Then, halfway through dessert, Dad looked across the table. "So, how's work going? Busy? Must be nice making accountant money." I shrugged. "It pays the bills." He nodded slowly. "Good." Then he picked up his coffee mug and said something so casually that almost nobody else noticed. "Family takes care of family." For the first time, those words didn't sound comforting. They sounded like an invoice waiting to be mailed. That night, after driving back to Indianapolis, I couldn't sleep.
Around midnight, I opened my laptop. The spreadsheet was still sitting on my desktop. I clicked it open. For the first time, I added another section. Not for money, for conversations. Every request I could remember. Every promise. Every excuse. Every comment about family. Dates, names, context. No emotions. Just facts. If there was one thing I'd learned as an accountant, it was that memories fade. Documentation doesn't. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the growing file. Something inside me had changed. I still loved my family. That hadn't disappeared overnight. But trust? Trust had started cracking. And once a crack appears, it usually doesn't stop spreading. A few months later, during a 4th of July barbecue, I met someone who would unknowingly change the direction of my entire life. His name was Ethan. And unlike my family, he had never once treated love like something that needed to be repaid. We met at a 4th of July barbecue hosted by one of my coworkers. I almost didn't go. I'd spent the entire week buried in audit reports, surviving on iced coffee and protein bars. By Friday afternoon, all I wanted was my couch, a movie, and absolute silence. My coworker Jessica wasn't having it. "Come on, Emma," she laughed, grabbing my purse before I could protest. "You work way too much. Besides, there'll be burgers, fireworks, and maybe a cute guy or two." I rolled my eyes. "I'm here for the burgers." "Sure you are." An hour later, I was standing in a backyard full of folding chairs, kids running through sprinklers, country music playing from a Bluetooth speaker, and the unmistakable smell of barbecue drifting through the air. That's when I saw him. He was standing beside the grill, trying, and failing, to flip burgers while arguing with an older man about whether charcoal tasted better than propane. "I'm telling you," Ethan laughed, holding up a spatula. "If I burn these burgers, that's on the chef, not the grill." The older man pointed at him. "Son, you're the chef." Everyone burst out laughing, including me. He turned toward the sound, caught me smiling, and gave an exaggerated shrug. "Well, there goes my reputation." That was our first conversation. Not deep, not dramatic, just easy. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to perform. Over the next few months, we started seeing each other regularly. Coffee dates turned into weekend hikes. Weekend hikes turned into Sunday dinners. somewhere along the way, he became my safe place. What surprised me most wasn't Ethan. It was his family.
The first time I visited his parents' house, his mom, Linda, opened the front door before we even knocked. "There you are," she said, pulling me into a hug like she'd known me forever. The smell of homemade lasagna filled the house. His dad, Tom, waved from the kitchen. "Hope you're hungry. Linda cooked enough food to feed half the neighborhood." She laughed. "I always make extra." Nobody mentioned how much the groceries cost. Nobody joked about paying them back. Nobody acted like kindness was something you'd owe interest on later. After dinner, Linda handed me a container full of leftovers. "Take these home." "Oh, I couldn't." "You absolutely could," she smiled. "We'll never finish all of it." I waited for the familiar sentence. "We'll settle up later." It never came. On the drive home, I sat quietly staring out the passenger window. Ethan noticed. "You okay?" I smiled. "Your family is different." He looked confused. "Different how?" "They do nice things without expecting anything." He laughed softly. "I thought that's what families were supposed to do." I looked down at my hands. So did I. But the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. A few months later, Ethan invited me to spend Christmas with his family. I hesitated. My parents expected me home every year. Skipping Christmas would start a fight I wasn't ready for. So I split my time. Christmas Eve with my parents. Christmas Day with Ethan's family. The contrast was impossible to ignore. At my parents' house, Dad spent half of dinner complaining about heating costs and grocery prices. Mom quietly agreed with everything he said. Lily joked that holiday meals should come with invoices. Everyone laughed. I forced a smile. The next morning at Ethan's parents' house, Tom burned the cinnamon rolls. Linda teased him about it. Everyone laughed even harder. No complaints, no scorekeeping, no guilt. Just love. Driving home that evening, Ethan reached across the center console and squeezed my hand. "You've been quiet all day." "I've just been thinking." "About what?" I looked out at the snow-covered highway. I spent my whole life believing every family kept score. He frowned. "What do you mean?" I almost told him. Almost. About the notebook, the contract, the endless money requests. Instead, I smiled and said, "It's a long story." He smiled back. "I've got time." Neither of us knew it then, but before that story was over, he'd witnessed something no groom should ever have to see. Because the day he asked me to marry him, my father quietly started planning an invoice. And I was about to discover just how expensive being his daughter had become.